Hello, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 6th, and you are at the Kubernetes SIG Testing bi-weekly meeting. I am one of the SIG Testing chairs, and I am your host today, Aaron of SIGBeard, or SpiffXP, on Slack and GitHub. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube and will be publicly viewable. So we ask that you all adhere to the Kubernetes code of conduct by being your best selves, not being jerks. And if you have any concerns, please reach out to me, or if the concerns are about me or any of the other chairs, you are also welcome to reach out to conduct@kubernetes.io. So with that, we have a pretty busy agenda. I'm going to try and keep us to 10 minutes per item, and I will hand over to Rob to talk about CI policy updates. Also, if anybody needs to screen share, just let me know, and I'll make you a co-host so you can do that.
Okay, so the main thing that I just want to note here is that over the past week or two, I've been working on a CI signal status update report. And the primary use case for this is for the CI signal team lead to be able to automatically generate a report that goes to TestGrid, gets a list of summaries for the jobs on SIG release informing and SIG release blocking tab groups, and goes through those tests that are flaking and lists out the tests that are actually flaking on a per job basis. And then, so at the moment, I'm throwing up or producing CSV that gives the flaking tests per job, per SIG, and the intention in next week's development is just to add what issues have been logged for the flaking tests reported there in GitHub. So if we have issues, great, I'll put them against the row, and if I don't have issues, then I will flag that as, oh, we have a flaking test that isn't being tracked by CI signal. So that's the update. So that is kind of blocking me from doing the CI policy signal, or sorry, the CI policy updates. But I expect to be able to return to that work from hopefully next Monday. So I think between now and a little bit of weekend work, I should have my test flakes joined to GitHub issues report done by next Monday.
Cool. Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns about that?
And the other thing is that although I was thinking about putting this into the experiments folder in test infra, I've gotten feedback from SIG release that they have a repo that I can drop this into, and that whole SIG release team will be able to give me feedback on that, because it's more of a report for CI signal and SIG release rather than it's about tests, but it's tracking the CI signal work. If that makes sense.
That said, like our previous tools for tracking like the health of tests are all SIG testing and test infra.
Now, and that has been a useful reference, and there certainly is, from a code point of view, overlap. And in actual fact, when I go to TestGrid and get the job status, the job status structure down, there are fields there that, were they filled out, I wouldn't need to do this report, and specifically that's the fields linking test flakes to bug reports are presently blank. So I could very much see this tool, Ben, being an interim tool, you know. But yeah, the feedback from Stephen was to put into K-release, you know.
How much of this, out of curiosity, how much of this is due to the friction of Bazel?
Oh, none really. Like, I mean, so it have to be, you have to walk in the shoes of a CI signal team lead to experience the pain of doing that report manually on the Monday. It consumes your Monday, you know. So I'm just turning this into a single click button action to get that status update. There are potential future enhancements of this in terms of maybe running it as a proud job, maybe generating time series data that could be consumed by Prometheus and graphed out in Grafana, but that's down the line sort of thinking for this, you know. So I would say whatever repo it lives in, just keep an eye on it, because it may be useful, and it could be that we might look at this in a few weeks' time and go, actually, no, let's take. You might look at this and go, let's take this code and let's use it. It's a bit of a tricky one. It's one of those CI signal things where it falls between testing and falls between SIG release, and have a look at the code and see what you think, Ben. I would say. And Aaron, and come back to me with looking at it and trying to make it maintainable. All that kind of stuff.
I'm not overly concerned with repo. I do think though that while SIG release may be stepping people to like look at the CI dashboard and whatnot, the infrastructure of testing is kind of the main thing that is actually in the SIG's wheelhouse.
Yeah. So like, I mean, do you think it should be in test info?
Ideally, I would like to see us have all of the tools that make test results more actionable. Those kind of do fall under the charter of SIG testing, right? And I always like to feel like we're not in charge of writing your tests for you, but we want to help make it easier for you to like get useful stuff from your test results. So I don't have a super I want people to feel empowered to go forth and iterate. So if that is where you feel safest doing that, I'm okay with that at the moment, and possibly reevaluating. My one, the other little like engineer thing that's going off for me is just duplication of effort. It sounds like you're using test grid as your source of truth for what flaking tests are.
So I'm effectively, what I'm doing is I'm joining up test grid and the CI signal project board.
Okay.
Yeah. So where we log issues and we have it on the board going from waiting response to triage to under investigation, observing. So there's opportunities there for CI signal to track the CI signal effort in terms of logging issues and aging those issues, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. And I think it sounds like it might be worth trying to get a conversation going about if and how we could link GitHub issues to test grid failures. I believe we had
you've thought about it before.
Was talking about something called like etymologist, I think, a while back, that was sort of supposed to run as a component in a Kubernetes cluster that would kind of connect issues that had a sort of a well-formed syntax to the data structure that test grid reads to populate those fields. So that might be worth examining as some prior art for linking those together.
What I would, sorry to cut across you, but what I would say is that this is almost a pet project. It's almost by me and for me, and I am not precious about putting in this effort and putting it wherever and having people look at it, evaluate it, see what's useful, see what's not useful, and have it as a true piece of prototype report that we then come back and circle back to and go, right, okay, where is the best place for this? And but there's so much that drops between the two teams that I just felt the need to crack on and get something.
I hear what you're saying, which is why my top level message is like, I want you to feel empowered to go forth and iterate. I think I'm just trying to sort of, it's helpful for us to remind ourselves what prior art exists if you want to look at it. So the only other thing I'll put out as an idea is all of our test results end up going through a data pipeline. They land in GCS, and then there's a thing called Kettle that takes them and transforms them into sort of more structured data that lands in a BigQuery database that is publicly queryable. We have
Yes.
proud jobs that run queries against this. One of those proud
Ah,
jobs is
yeah.
to identify for every single job what are the tests that both pass and fail for the same commit. And so I think there's like a JSON file that's linked off somewhere from the metrics directory in test infra that may be restricted just to the pull request jobs, but the query that runs actually does this for all the jobs, not even just the like.
Yeah.
So even more than the release informing and blocking ones. So it could be that you could key off of the job names, which you can get from TestGrid, I think.
Yes.
And you could link with that JSON thing, and you could get flakes that are happening that are not yet identified as flakes according to TestGrid, or like persistent failures according to TestGrid.
Okay.
And to take that one step further, we also had that same data set is used in driving the triage dashboard. And we at one point in time had a bot that was responsible for looking at like the top flakes on that dashboard and creating issues according to those, and then trying to use the SIG name in there to automatically tag it with the SIG and tag it with a test failure and whatnot. So I'm just throwing them out there as things you could use, but I'm in favor of having done CI signal myself, having also written a script that scrapes TestGrid and tries to make a presentable data structure from it. I understand your pain.
Yeah.
So.
Well, then what I'd ask, if you get a chance, to review the code, it's I've separated out into data collection and then data formatting, and I think you'd be able to go through it fairly quickly. I think I want to end my time box now, but I might have a quick chat with you and get some references on. I'm interested in running queries against that BigQuery database. That could be useful.
Okay.
A little bit more robust as well, I think.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And yes, I would say let's hand off to Elmiko. I don't know what your actual name is, so.
My name is Mike or Michael, but Elmiko is fine as well.
Cool.
Nice to meet you all. So I guess I'm Mike McCune. I work for Red Hat, and I prepared a little slide deck just to help talk about kind of the issue I wanted to talk about here. So I'm going to attempt to share it, and hopefully that'll work. Okay, I guess, is everybody seeing this slide deck? Okay, cool. So I'm kind of relatively new to working directly on Kubernetes. I've only been working on the autoscaler for about 6 months now and working in Cluster API as well. And we've integrated Cluster API with the autoscaler. But one of the problems that this has created for us is that we would like to now run end-to-end tests using the Cluster API provider with the autoscaler. So some of the goals that we're looking to get out of this is, we would like to be able to add Cluster API as a provider to those tests. We'd also like to be able to enable more automated tests for the cluster autoscaler, because currently I think these tests are just run periodically and they're only run on GCE and GKE, I think. Hopefully by doing this, we'd kind of open a pathway for more contributors to create cluster autoscaler tests, for their providers. So part of the goal here is to pave a pathway for people to create more providers for these tests. And then, I think a stretch goal would be maybe we could demonstrate how other tests that have providers linked to them could do the same sort of transformation. So, with that said, this is kind of like a really 10,000 foot view of what's going on currently. In the Kubernetes repo, the cluster autoscaler tests are there in the E2E testing. The provider interface is also there, and we have what are essentially 3 concrete implementations of that interface. GKE, GCE, and KubeMark. Now, so far, Ben Moss from VMware has been putting together a proof of concept for us. And what we wanted to do, the line of thinking we had was we would just pull the tests completely out of the Kubernetes repo, write a new provider interface, and then write a provider implementation kind of outside of that, with the idea that we could bring the tests themselves back into the repo and maybe the provider interface as well, but the provider code could still live outside of the repo. And this was kind of our first line of thinking. So, example one is kind of like, this is how one way we could go forward with this. We could propose a CAPI implementation of the provider interface to the Kubernetes repo. But as I linked this issue that Tim St. Clair pointed me at, it seems like I don't think there's good acceptance for adding more providers into the Kubernetes repo. So although we could proceed this way, and I think this would be based on input from the group here, this was just one example, and I think it's probably maybe the highest impedance example. Another example of what we were thinking was to keep the cluster autoscaler tests in the Kubernetes repo, to improve the interface there for the cluster autoscaler providers, and create a small library as well. And this library would help individual providers do like the setup and tear down that the tests expect. And so in this model, the providers would be outside of the Kubernetes repo, and individual providers would just create as they felt necessary. I'm going to go through one more example, and then I'll get to kind of the discussion topics. So the third example here would be like, what if we take the tests out of the Kubernetes repo and we take the providers out as well, and just allow the tests to live in another location, perhaps next to the autoscaler, and the providers could live in their own repos as normal. So these are kind of the three ideas we're thinking about currently on how we could integrate with the rest of the testing. Now, I think each one of these, example one kind of seems undesirable because, we're just adding more provider specific code into the Kubernetes repo. Example two, I think we have some acceptance from the auto scaling group. They like the idea of keeping the tests in the Kubernetes repo and adding more of a library there, and then allowing the providers to live in an external manner. But this kind of brings the question in, how would we link a provider to the test during deployment? That would have to be some sort of dynamic linking step. And, Go doesn't have great support for this, so we would have to work with, the testing community and the testing frameworks we have to do that. Example three is kind of the easiest approach from a breakage standpoint, because we can just start afresh. But I think it represents a shift in kind of thinking for how the tests would be deployed, from the Kubernetes repo, how they'd be run, how they would fit in with the rest of the structure. So what I'd, kind of like to talk about the group here is what ideas do you have? Has anybody thought about this idea of provider separation? What would be the most, what would be the most copacetic way to do this with the testing group in mind? And then what should be the next approach? Do we need to write a CAP about this? Do you want to see a proof of concept, or what would the group like to see? So I guess, thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
Quick note, first of all, is that we're certainly not, we're not introducing providers currently. That is definitely the case. In fact, the goal is to remove all of the existing provider stuff. It's a little unclear exactly how that's going to work for the tests. There's been a lot of work put into how to remove it from the core components. So we're encouraging essentially everything to use the fake skeleton provider, with possibly some circle back on that ought to be the default and perhaps a confusing name. We also have some precedent for things that kind of like don't use core APIs having their own test binaries. So like, for example, the Node E2E tests are doing all kinds of things that you might not necessarily consider actually Kubernetes, like SSHing to the actual underlying node and poking around. And so for those, they're in their own test binary. And that might be something to consider here, is like splitting these off. It isn't super clear that there will be a like definite like core API standard for this, right? Like this is an add-on, right?
You mean is cluster autoscaler an add-on, or?
Yeah, like anything the test is going to interact with is not a like it's not an API that comes with Kubernetes core, correct?
I mean, it's, it interacts with, obviously looks at pods and nodes and stuff like that. So it looks at those pieces of the core API. But for the provider side of things, yeah, that would be specific to whatever provider is being implemented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Does that answer the question? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that should at least be considered when we're writing this up. There certainly are tests today that do terrible things, like exactly test a specific, not just like cloud provider or something, but specific cluster implementations, like firewall rules, for example, is one of the more ridiculous ones that we haven't purged yet. We definitely don't want to introduce more of that. We want to figure out what to do to sort of purge those. It kind of hasn't been super high priority or momentum to delete them. Most of them aren't, causing problems by existing. They're not default tests, and they aren't themselves introducing new dependencies on things. But we still kind of centrally have the like core Kubernetes cloud provider abstraction concept tied into things. That's a bit difficult to remove. But I think we want to move away from that where possible and get to a place where the edb.test binary just works on clusters and doesn't know about cloud providers, and cloud providers have their own tests.
Yeah. So this, like, originally I had started a document talking about how we might do this, and that was my original thinking, was that we would just have the tests externally separate, allow the providers to kind of bring the test in as a library, and then let each provider build a binary that they would just run against, like a kube config, and it would just do the right things for their test. I guess the question there is, if we created that much separation between where the different code pieces are, is there an acceptable way for us to bring that into the automated testing that happens, like, that's triggered by prow on like PRs and whatnot? Is there a way we could bring that back into the fold?
We've for the sort of the glue that we use in CI, there's this project kubetest 2, and it's headed in the direction of like itself having each of the tests be a binary that essentially expects to receive a kube config and a few additional niceties. And then it similarly has sort of a standard contract but separate binaries for a deployer binary that is aware of how to manage a cluster, but imports a library with a bunch of code that does sort of like CI integration and lifecycle glue. Like, we want to make sure it gets torn down on SIG term from the pod that we're running a test in and that sort of thing. So actually the model there is pretty much what you described. Like, you're going to have some tester binary, and it's going to receive like credentials for the cluster, and there will be some wrap around it that kind of handles bridging things to CI.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds exactly like what we want. So I guess, like, last question, this has been really productive, but I do want to be sensitive about the time here. I guess if we go with the kubetest 2 model of things, should we just write our POCs and kind of build it all? Or is there a cap that, like, the testing group would like to see to talk about what we're going to do? What would you guys like to see?
One thing I didn't quite get from what you were talking about before is exactly how much we have in the existing binary. Because it might be worthwhile, sort of reviewing the impact of, like, what should we do with that?
Yeah.
If we go write this new thing. But otherwise, I think it would be totally reasonable to just kind of go do your own thing and reach out for any help you need. And it seems like something that might be reasonable to ship sort of like with the cluster autoscaler project. I think that's the direction we're trying to encourage, is that, like, each project ship their own. I mean, further, some of the people on my side at Google that are working on this tooling are also supporting projects that are not actually even part of the Kubernetes org. So it's kind of the same thing. Like we're not going to put any of their like tester stuff into core, but like leaving a path where they can ship their own.
Okay, because they're like, I know I said last question, but you know, there are the tests that are in the core right now. They're you know, there's like a minimal handful of tests for the autoscaler, and they're all linked very closely, you know, to like the Google platforms. And so, you know, they're good tests, but they run very infrequently. And I think I was looking at them recently; they've been failing for the longest time. So I think the value that we're getting back from those is very low. And you know, the concern that we have from the CAPI side of things is that we would like to make, you know, CAPI is iterating a lot and it's integrating with the autoscaler. The rest of the autoscaler providers are kind of stable at this point, but we want to make sure we're not going to break the autoscaler as we start to ramp up, you know, higher versions of cluster API. So, you know, long term, we'd like to get to a place where we can run these automated on commits. And I just want to make sure that what we're doing will fit in line with that if it's accepted eventually.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the sort of thing that we would have in pre-submit anyhow. So we can run in CI, and we don't really, we're not going to be super concerned about like what repo it is. I mean, if it were something that's completely outside of the Kubernetes org, that may raise some concerns. But you know, if it's some Kubernetes SIG project and you want to run CI, that's not a problem. And then you know, getting like the release team or something to look at it is sort of its own discussion. And again, it doesn't really depend on where it is. And I'd actually say that you'll probably have an easier time. It's currently a little bit expensive to iterate in the Kubernetes repo. You'll probably have a much smoother time if you're just talking about a handful of tests that you're losing here.
And that's why we wanted to separate it, because we didn't want to bother all the, you know, all the Kube reviewers. Anyways, I really appreciate this. I guess if nobody has any other comments, like, this has been really productive for me. So thank you very much.
Good. I appreciate your time and the presentation. To answer your question about POC or KEP, I hate to give you the answer of why not both. If I were going through this process, I feel like a POC is probably going to uncover some of the gnarled details that would help create a more fully formed KEP. And I agree, like the challenge for me is when you use the word provider, there's the cluster API provider, the cloud provider, the credentials provider, the storage provider. There's a bunch of stuff. And I think we're trying to sort of, unfortunately, be the bad guys and say like, look, this provider thing that all of our tests rely upon, we need to just stop building on that. And we need to come up with a better solution. So I think iterating out of repo, you know, your third option of like the least amount of breakage is probably also going to be the best way for us to figure out what's a more extensible model going forward. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, cool. I appreciate it. Everybody who told me I was crazy with option 3, I'll go back and tell them what you said. So.
Okay. Elmiko, I appreciate you doing this. I implemented the downstream tests for this with Ben, and it was a mess. And it was like, yeah, it's really tricky to measure this stuff. So thanks for doing this.
So next up, I'm going to hand off to Ben to talk about the DockerHub policy changes, what that means for us.
Is this thing going to work? Okay. Have to see here. I've got my little distraction this morning. He just, you know, something about 10 o'clock meetings, he gets all wired up. Yeah, so I think probably many of you have heard about an impending change from Docker Inc. They're going to change some of their policies around DockerHub. This is mostly sort of a PSA to get people thinking about this a bit. I have a few particular thoughts in mind, but at a super high level, they're going to start rate limiting a bit how many polls you can have as a client if you're not authenticated, and even if you are authenticated. And they're going to start garbage collecting images that aren't pulled. The latter doesn't seem like a problem. It looks like, in brief, that shouldn't be a big deal for us, and especially in particular, all projects have the ability to store things through our workgroup K8s Infra and Bench Promoter in GCR, where they will never be deleted. at least as of yet. So worst case, you can always have a copy backed up there. But the changes where we're going to be limited on how many polls we can do seem like something that are potentially pretty problematic for a lot of the CI throughout the project, where who knows how many images we're pulling from DockerHub. Even if we're building and shipping our own images somewhere else, is pretty likely we have base images we're pulling or random images in the EDB. So I think we probably need to look at minimizing our dependency on this for live polls and things like the Kubernetes end-to-end tests. And we probably also need to look at getting the CI authenticated on some non-elevated credential to DockerHub, or possibly a pool of them, and look at running a cache for pull-through. I'm a bit concerned that this is coming in about a month or so, and I don't think anybody's taken a super strong look at this for Kubernetes, and that we're probably going to have all sorts of CI issues crop up. So yeah, I think my main proposals are we should look at getting a sort of official Kubernetes CI pull credential, and we should look at running a pull-through cache. But I'm not sure if there's anything else we should be thinking about there, and I would like people in the SIG to, if they can, take a look at this before the changes land. I believe they're landing early November. Thanks.
Out of curiosity, how many people here use DockerHub images in their testing?
We actually do a lot. Pretty much every Windows job currently running on Kubernetes uses DockerHub registry.
We have some DockerHub, but mostly we move to Quay for a lot of our stuff.
I think also I forgot to mention, we should be saved at least a little bit by the fact that when we're pulling into EDB clusters that are on, say, GC or Azure, hopefully the nodes will have random IPs, and if you're not authenticated, the rate limits are by IP. But I'm not sure we want to rely on that, and there's other cases like kind clusters where that's not true, or for image builds. I think the real question would ask, how many of you are confident that you're not using a DockerHub image somewhere?
Okay. Like Ben mentioned, one of my thoughts is the project does have built-in support for any Kubernetes SIG to get storage space for whatever images they need to use for their various sub-projects. They'll end up at kates.gcr.io. And I would be interested in understanding why people aren't using that and how we can make that better. Not necessarily saying you have to answer it right now. If there are any thoughts you have off the top of your head, that's great. But I think sort of longer term, I'd be interested in understanding how the project can use the infrastructure it has to meet the needs of its contributors.
Yeah, in our scenario, we basically have to merge the pull requests that are sent, which adds Windows support to the rest of the conformance images that we are using. And then that would basically mean that the image builder, the Kubernetes image builder, is going to build those Windows images, and then they are going to be hosted on the Kates GCR.io registry. And that's going to be problem solved for us as well. Basically, I have two pull requests, which adds support to the rest of the conformance images, Windows support. And of course, we are going to need the buildx pull requests, which I have listed in the agenda down below. I guess we can talk about that then.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Ben, do you have any plans or thoughts to send out a note to the rest of KDev or a warning? So I can bring this up in SIG CLI tomorrow but I'm sure there's other SIGs that aren't represented here.
Yeah, I didn't have any concrete plans yet. I was kind of hoping to, get feedback on that sort of thing here. That really sounds like something we should do.
Yeah, I think maybe this was the start of that conversation, just to sort of spitball and get a real quick feeling for how many people are aware this is coming and the potential impact it could have.
I think we did have something blasted out, but it was like back when they announced it, which is, it's too far on everyone's horizon of like, oh, this isn't a problem right now.
Okay, cool. In the interest of time boxing, let's move on to Jay to talk about the net policy framework cap. That's not really a framework.
Yeah, yeah, I shouldn't have called it a framework. I'm sorry. Okay, so can I share my screen?
Let me make you a co-host.
Cool.
Make co-host. You have the power.
All right. Okay, cool. All right, yeah, so for folks that aren't, this goes back a ways. We've had a lot of tech debt in the network policy tests for a while. And so I started working on this a while ago with Sedef. I actually mentioned Sedef. I think Sedef's here. She just joined also. She worked on a few CNIs. So the overall problem is that we actually, and a lot of people don't know this, is we don't actually run these in CI at all. And that's okay for now. That's not the problem I wanted to solve today, but they aren't run in CI. And I think one of the reasons they're not run in CI is because as they stand, they're very slow, and there's been issues with them. We fixed some of them here over at VMware, but there's just the fact that these have been broken for so long means CNI providers also haven't been running them. So I've been working with different CNI providers, both Calico and Antria, to really like put together a way to run these tests that's kind of fast and sane and easy to maintain. So the number one thing I know the concern is framework. When I wrote the cap with me, Sedef, a bunch of other people, what we did is we took a lot of the concepts in what are going on in the Calico CI, stateful pods, and we took the polling and probing of those pods and we merged them with other things that we needed in terms of performance and test coverage. I asked Sean if it was okay if I shared some of the conversations we used to have in the back channels about this, but these were really hard to debug a while ago in the current state of affairs because the pods go away. And so you've got a network policy, you're testing if it works and the pod dies. Not only is it bad, but in slow clusters, this is really bad because you have to spin up so many pods to test all the policies. And the problem gets worse and worse. And then every new test that we add is about 100 new lines of code. So it's already to the point of unmaintainable, really bad. So so the way the new tests work, so anyways, there's issues about this that have been around for a while. This was February 5th that came out. And then so we can go back into the history, but anyways, so we have this cap, and I think so Ben, I updated it to clarify that, the goal is not to push this cap on SIG testing. That was never the goal, but I think maybe it was read that way because probably the way it was worded when I was talking to Bowie about it originally, because we had this idea that maybe every test could eventually be a diagnostic. So what does the new test do? Well, it's not adding technical debt, it's removing technical debt. So I did the math today just to make sure. So we've separated these into files. If having extra files is not a good thing, we could combine them all into one file. But the net change is a net decrease in code, okay? And it's a net decrease in code, and it's a net, more importantly from a technical perspective, it's a net increase in coverage, and it's a way net increase in readability, right? So this is how you write a new test. So it's about 10 lines of code to write a test. And because the whole thing is probed like concurrently, these tests run in about 1/10 of the time or less than the original tests run. And so there's there's a demo of this in the SIG network a year ago where it was generally approved to finish working on this and to merge it in. And I made the mistake of, not actually, considering the fact that this is an end-to-end test in the E2E test binaries, but I just assumed that the reason I thought I didn't need to really do this in the SIG testing world was because there's kind of one of the rules for KEPs is that if you're writing a new test, which I think from SIG tests abstraction, that's all this is, it's just fixing an old test. You don't need to write a KEP. So I felt like the KEP was for SIG, it was a SIG network KEP because the whole point of it was working with Antrea and Calico and the other CNI providers to get a test that we could actually feasibly run in CI. So I would like to run this in SIG testing CI, but I think that problem is kind of orthogonal to the KEP, which is let's get these tests working in a way that the providers can use them. So there's the net change. This is the new output for these tests. So this solves the original issue that was kind of put up here, which is that nobody can really understand these when people are trying to figure out what these policies are doing. So the way they work now is every policy, and actually, I think this would be cool if we could do this in more E2E tests over time. Every policy shows the exact policy in JSON, and then the exact matrix of connections that worked and didn't work. So these can be, in a matter of seconds, you can figure out exactly why and what was happening. So, so that's the overall context for everything. I did also create a pull request into enhancements so that like this doesn't happen again, because I guess there's some confusion in the KEP template where it says, check the impact on testing, but it doesn't say if you're improving tests. So I added a little a little change there. It says like, even if you're just improving tests, make sure it checks the impact of everything. So that's my explanation of all this stuff. So sorry for alarming you guys the other day. I know it was kind of came out of nowhere.
Thanks a ton for that. No, yeah, that change sounds pretty reasonable. The thing that got me was someone pointed me to this PR asking questions about it in the SIG testing channel, and it's this enormous PR that says it's adding a test framework into e2e.test. Yeah. That set off some alarm bells where that is the sort of thing that we would definitely want to know about. And then I followed back through the KEP, and the KEP, was mostly like TBD on like reviewers and approvers.
So I did that, and so that's LGT. I updated the KEP now, Ben. So it's LGTM now. If someone else could LGTM it would be great. But Bowie reviewed it yesterday, so it's I updated that. So that's also my fault. But here's all the reviewers and stuff, and I made it very clear that we're not gonna like dump this thing on y'all. That's not the point. But that said, I really think it would be cool if we could move towards table-driven tests, and I'd like to help with that at some point if we ever did that. But I know there's a million people with other test improvement ideas. So
this work also really useful. Thank you for that. It's just up in a giant PR that says, adding a test framework that sets off some like, hey, wait a sec.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So I guess we're in a decent place. Let me know if anything you want me to do to help with this. And also, the one other thing I wanted to ask is there anybody that would be interested in helping me to get these into the actual testing for CI? I mean, I don't mind doing it all myself, but I'd just be Googling around a lot. I don't know if who's a good mentor to work with on that. I could probably get Stephen Augustus to help me. He's here at VMware, but I'm not sure if there's an official way to do this.
I want to be helpful. I also want to be realistic about the fact that I am prone to disappearing for large periods of time. I'm hoping that that's going to come, the most recent bout of that is going to come to an end. So I think my ask might more be like, I want to understand where our documentation is not answering your questions to begin with. Either you didn't find what you needed in the place that you expected, or it turns out the answer you're getting is tribal knowledge and not documented anywhere.
Okay. I just don't even know what docs to read anymore because there's so many repos. What was test info?
So I would start with the in test infra, the config jobs directory is where all of our job configs live for Prow. And there's a README in there that attempts to be a basic cookbook that tells you, if you want to run this kind of job, here's what the config should look like. If you want to test it, here's how you might test it.
Okay.
And then it tries to link to more informative references about like Prow's API and stuff like that. But it's trying to sort of be, since it's specifically about Kubernetes jobs, it's trying to be about the conventions that we use for prow.k8s.io, as opposed to what like OpenShift or JetStack or other Prow deployments use.
Okay.
And yeah, I was going to maybe recommend George, the testing commons folks might have some more experience helping out. So I'd like drop questions in Slack for sure, and when we've got time, we'll answer for sure. But yeah.
I
Okay.
also, specifically for setting up CI with SIG networking, I would victimize my favorite victim, Antonio.
Yeah. I work
super,
on work with.
I don't know if he, has time right now either, but I'm kind of in the same boat of Aaron. Is like, I'd love to help. I'm a little hesitant to sign up for anything else.
Jorge
Yeah.
said he'd help. So
Sorry, I apologize. I forget if it's Jorge or George. I'll get it right.
Both of them are valid.
Okay. All right. Cool.
I guess he's Jorge to me and George to you.
Yeah, but definitely would like to help, and also like to help help you find the documentation and improve whatever documentation there is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
My other meta comment is just, I think your instincts about it being mostly self-contained to SIG networking are probably okay, but I still think I'm about to add a large chunk of code to the test directory. I still think like maybe asking, like giving us a heads up and asking for a review probably might have avoided the surprise here. Like I think that would give us the opportunity to be like, oh, this is not our thing. You're good. But I feel like one of the problems we have to remind ourselves of in Kubernetes is that like it's really helpful to over communicate because too often there are people who are like, well, I never heard of that. Why wasn't I involved? And so
I'm usually good at over communicating. This is the one time I screwed up.
Anyway, it's all good. I appreciate the presentation. Looks like you dropped slides in the notes. So cool. I'm going to move us along to CloudView to talk about using BuildX for test images.
Yeah, so I'm here with Ernest Wang. Our primary goal is to basically have Windows support on pretty much any and every image. And currently we're going to have to talk about the Kubernetes test images. Recently, we've also submitted a pull request for the pause image, which has been approved and has to be LGTM'd again. So that's good, which was also switched to BuildX and also adds Windows images to that as well, which is great. So now about the test images. Currently, the image builder is also building Windows images for a couple of the test images. But to do that, it uses a couple of remote Docker nodes, Windows Docker nodes in Azure, just to build those Windows images. And someone said that maybe that's not such a great idea to rely too much on external resources. And that basically made me think of an alternative, and that was Docker BuildX. I have managed to create that pull request with all the BuildX implementation details that were required for Windows as well, including for all the conformance images. I also did a full conformance run on Windows nodes of all conformance tests, and they all passed. So it's working. So it's really helpful that the pose image BuildX implementation already got approved, because it uses a lot of the mechanisms for there. But for test images, there are a couple of extra workarounds we kind of have to use. For a couple of images, we need to run commands, and for that, because we're trying to build Windows images, we cannot run commands on the Windows stage. It's impossible. For the most part, we are running commands on the Linux stage of the images, which works perfectly fine. But there are a few cases in which we cannot run those commands on Linux. There are a couple of cases in which we have to use a couple of external helpers. Those helpers are also included in the pull request. They're Docker files. In particular, we need a BusyBox helper and a PowerShell helper, which basically prepares those bits just so we can then include them in the final images. And that's one of the things that everyone will kind of have to agree on. At the moment, with the pull requests I've sent, the image builder will no longer require any Windows images, with the condition that it can use those helpers that I've mentioned. So that is the first point that everyone will have to agree on. Any idea?
I mean, certainly in the name of merging and iterating, it sounds like a substantial step forward from where we are. And then I think we should, just like you sort of had the, hey, we should not use Windows nodes. I think the next question would be how can we make sure that the building of these helper images or running things in Windows or whatever, like making sure that that process can still be done by like anyone in the community. The goal here is to make sure that the community is self-sustaining. And so if any particular vendor disappears or withdraws their support, that the community still has all of the artifacts, tools, and infrastructure it needs to be able to recreate things from scratch. So I think this leaves us in a state where we kind of have some dependence on some images that we maybe don't have the infrastructure to build available to us right now, but I think we can have the longer conversation later about how we can provide that to the community. Sorry, you were going to say, Ben.
I think the important change here is that it minimizes how much needs to be done in the build, like to just these small helper things that hopefully don't need to be frequently built.
Yeah, ideally they will never have to be rebuilt ever again. They're pretty straightforward. For example, the PowerShell helper, basically it has to update some PowerShell related caches, which then are copied over into the final image. It kind of has to do that. And there's no real reason to update them ever again after that. Of course, the Docker files are included in the pull request. So if anyone will ever want to build those images themselves, they're gonna need a Windows node for that, and just one. But yeah, that's it. And additionally, this will also help in the future when we'll want to add multiple OS versions, support for multiple OS versions of Windows for those test images. Right now, we kind of have to have multiple Windows nodes for that, but with BuildX, we no longer have to do that. And not to mention that if we ever have to build some internal versions of Windows, with BuildX, we won't have to have a separate build node for that.
Yeah, thanks for this work, Claudia. This is a pretty awesome improvement here.
Yeah,
It's nice
and
leverage
there's just one other minor thing that we kind of have to agree on. We are using nano server images as a base image for all the images. The reason for that is that they are a lot smaller than the server core counterparts. They're at least 10 times smaller. That basically means that the nano server image is like 200 megabytes, while the server core images are 2 gigabytes or more compressed. And considering that we build for multiple OS versions, currently for 3, you have to multiply that by 3. So we are building images for nano server. That's what we're doing. And for most images, that's perfectly fine. But in some cases, we do need a couple of DLLs, which are not included by default in nano server. And we pull those from server core. Now, it wouldn't be a great idea to pull those server core images every time the image builder job runs. Again, they're huge, and basically they will at least triple or quadruple the build time just for those images, not to mention any potential costs associated with that. So I was suggesting having a periodic job, a monthly job, which builds a cache image, which only contains those DLLs we depend on. And basically we just build that image and pull that server core image once per month. And then in the regular image builder job, we just use that cache to get the necessary DLLs. And this is the second bit that we kind of have to agree on regarding this implementation.
I mean, that sounds perfectly reasonable to me. Like if a monthly update rate is sufficient for that, then we can, I mean, that sounds like a nice optimization for building the test image potentially much more frequently.
Yeah, Microsoft releases new base images for all its images every month. So it's monthly sufficient in this regard.
That sounds good to me. I mean, part of the thing for me is visibility into whether we have an outsized resource consumption. What you're describing doesn't sound like that will be a problem. So I think, like, yeah, any decision is certainly subject to, like, hey, we've noticed that resource usage for this particular piece of infrastructure or these sets of jobs is sort of out of line and we need to rethink. But everything you've discussed sounds reasonable, and I think the things you're looking for agreement on should be the usage of these helper images that, you know, we can't automatically build using our infrastructure, and occasionally using our infrastructure to build smaller cache or base images. Those sound reasonable to me as a chair.
Yeah. Those were the main concerns that we had to agree on. And once this gets in, and the other two pull requests that I mentioned, we won't really have to use DockerHub for testing purposes like we do for so many boards, test grids, and so on and so forth. And speaking of which, just since it's about DockerHub, all the base images for all the test images are on DockerHub. So we might have to move those base images to Kate's GCR.io as well. That includes Alpine and BusyBox and everything like that for any architecture and so on and so forth, since we talked about DockerHub.
Yeah, and I think that sounds maybe doable. That might, like, it might lead to a broader conversation, possibly even at the CNCF level, about sort of all of the members of the CNCF and in the ways in which they can contribute to this project's resources for CI. I think, yeah, I think migrating to kates.gcr.io probably sounds reasonable. We get into a tricky thing of like not wanting to be a mirror for the worldwide ecosystem, because a substantial amount of the project's costs right now do go to serving hosted artifacts. But I think like that sounds like a reasonable approach, and we can start down that path and adjust if we find out it's not working out the way we expected.
I think we don't have a good pattern to manage them yet. We'll need to look at it, but for something like we just need a periodic job to pull this large image, the size actually shouldn't matter from a rate limiting perspective. It's just number of images. And since it's infrequent, it shouldn't be a big deal. But even if it was, we could add credentials. I think the more interesting thing there is that we do this build in Cloud Build, and I have no idea, like, will Cloud Build be sharing VMs with other random jobs and therefore IPs? And like, are we going to have unavoidable rate limits there, or do we need to authenticate? If we need to authenticate our Cloud Builds, even then, I think we could, we could, in theory, have like a user account for like this build. I think we might run into problems here. I don't think the problem is going to be that we have this build, though. I think we might just kind of run into some general issues, and whatever would apply to everything else will apply there without costing us excessively versus anything else. I do think if we moved like the primary host of like Windows Server Core to kates.gcr.io, that would probably be a problem for the project, as just like a bandwidth cost from all the third-party users.
The idea was to not have the Windows Server Core at all in GCR.io. We wouldn't have to. We just have to pull it once per month, and that's it.
Yeah,
We're not saving the cache that I mentioned. It's only like 5 megabytes in size or something like that.
Yeah, the cost is going to be negligible for that. So I want to be cognizant and respectful of people's time. We're 7 minutes over. So I think I'm going to cap us off there. I really appreciate all the time people put towards preparing to talk here to keep these conversations actionable. Hopefully we all got the decisions we needed. And I look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks' time. Until then, I'll see you all on Slack.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, everybody.